Leonard Ossie was a man who paid attention to details, not the small, forgettable kind, the kind that mattered. The kind that told you whether a foundation was sound or whether it was quietly giving way beneath the surface. He had spent 19 years as a forensic accountant, and in that time he had learned one undeniable truth. Numbers never lied. People did. Circumstances did. Memories, intentions, even love, all of it had a way of distorting over time. But a ledger kept honestly, told you exactly where things stood. For the past 11 months, the ledger of his marriage had been running a deficit he could not explain. His wife, Simone, had been the kind of woman who filled a room without trying, not loudly. The way warmth fills a room, gradually, completely, until the absence of it is the only thing you notice. They had been married for 14 years. They had a son, Isaiah, 17 years old and sharp in the way that only children raised in honest households can be. They had a house in Raleigh, North Carolina, on a quiet street with dogwoods in the front yard that Simone had planted herself the spring after they moved in. They had, by every measurement Leonard knew how to apply, a good life. And then, 11 months ago, something shifted. It started the way these things always start, so gradually that by the time you notice it, the change has already settled deep. Simone stopped reaching for his hand in the car. Not dramatically. Just stopped. She began taking her phone to the bedroom when she made calls. She started sleeping later on weekends, missing the Saturday morning routine they had kept for a decade. She answered his questions with the minimum number of words required and offered nothing beyond them. Leonard told himself it was work stress. She was a school counselor at a high school in Durham, and the year had been difficult. Budget cuts, overcrowded caseloads, a student crisis in February that had shaken the whole district. He gave her room. He told himself that was the loving thing to do, but the room he gave her seemed to grow wider on its own. Isaiah noticed before Leonard let himself. One evening in March, the two of them were in the garage, Isaiah helping him reorganize the shelving units, when his son went quiet for a moment and then said, without looking up from the box he was sorting, "Is everything okay between you and Mom?" Leonard set down the toolbox in his hand. "Why do you ask?" "She just seems far away," Isaiah said, "even when she's right there." Leonard pulled his son close for a moment. "I'm working on it," he said. But that was the problem. He had been working on it for 8 months by then, and he had made exactly no progress. Every conversation he attempted with Simone ended the same way, with her nodding, saying she was fine, saying she was tired, saying she would be better soon. Every overture he made was received politely and returned unopened. She was not cruel. She was not cold in the way of someone who had stopped caring. She was cold in the way of someone who was somewhere else entirely, in a room he could not find the door to. He began, in the way of a man trained to follow evidence, keeping a quiet record. He was not proud of it. He noticed the calls that ended when he walked into a room. He noticed the way she positioned her laptop away from him when she was online. He noticed that she had started driving herself to appointments she used to ask him to join her for. He noticed that the small jar of ibuprofen on her nightstand, which used to last them months, was being replaced every few weeks. He did not confront her. He told himself he was waiting for enough evidence to be certain before he said a word. But the truth, and he knew it, in the part of himself that dealt in honesty, was that he was afraid of what she might say. He called his older sister, Patricia, in Charlotte one Thursday evening. She listened all the way through, the way she always had, and then said, "Leonard, you need to talk to her, not hint at it. Talk to her." "I don't know how to start that conversation," he said. "You start by saying you're scared," she said. "That's usually where the truth lives." He didn't, not that week, and not the week after. Instead, he called an attorney. A colleague had used her, someone discreet, professional, precise. Leonard met with her on a Tuesday afternoon, told her the situation in the calm, factual way he told people most things, and walked out an hour later with a folder of preliminary documents and the particular hollowness of a man who has just made real something he had hoped would stay theoretical. He did not file anything. He told himself he was not ready. The truth was that he still could not fully bring himself to believe the number in the ledger. Something in the column did not add up. Simone had not changed in the way of someone who had stopped loving him. She had changed in the way of someone carrying something she did not know how to put down. He just didn't know what it was. The answer came on a Wednesday evening in October, and it came the way the most important things usually do, not when he was looking for it. He had come home early from a client meeting that had ended ahead of schedule. The house was quiet. Isaiah was at soccer practice. He came through the back door, set his laptop bag on the kitchen table, and was walking toward the hallway when he heard Simone's voice from the sunroom at the end of the house. The door was cracked. She was on the phone. He was not trying to listen. He stopped because he heard something in her voice he had not heard before. Not the controlled quiet she had used with him for months, but something underneath it, something raw and barely held. He stood very still. "I can't keep doing this, Renata." Renata, her closest friend from graduate school, a social worker in Atlanta. The name Leonard had seen appearing constantly in Simone's call history, so often he had begun to construct theories around it that were making him quietly sick with shame. He's going to find out, and he's going to find out wrong. He's going to think it was something it wasn't. A pause. Simone's voice lower. "The second surgery is scheduled for November. I didn't tell him about the first one." Her voice cracked on the last word, the clean, controlled fracture of someone who has been keeping something sealed for a very long time. "He's been managing Isaiah on his own for 11 months without knowing why I've been so gone. And every time I try to tell him, I keep thinking about his mother." Leonard did not move. She went through the diagnosis and the treatment, and she didn't tell anyone for months because she didn't want to change the way people looked at her. And Leonard watched that. He was 22. He still carries it. I have watched him carry it. A long, unsteady breath. I didn't want to be the person who put that look on his face. I could not stand the thought of him looking at me the way he looked at her when she told him, like he was already starting to grieve. The folder in his jacket pocket, the one with the preliminary documents, made a sound as Leonard's hand closed around it. 11 months of distance, 11 months of cold mornings and minimized conversations, and the creeping poisonous certainty that his wife had stopped wanting to be in their marriage. All of it collapsing now into something so much more painful and so much more precise. She was sick, and she had hidden it from him because she loved him. He backed quietly into the kitchen. He sat down at the table where they had shared 1,000 ordinary dinners. He put both hands flat on the surface and stared at them for a long time. "Before we go any further, if this story is landing somewhere real for you, take a breath and stay with it. What happens next inside this house is something a lot of families have lived through in one form or another, and it matters. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because the stories on this channel don't shy away from the complicated ones." Now, back to that kitchen in Raleigh. What Leonard was experiencing in that moment has a name in family psychology research. It is called a protective information gap, and it occurs specifically in relationships where one partner, facing a serious health crisis, makes the unilateral decision to shield the other from distress. The logic, from the inside, feels entirely reasonable. I know what this information will do to him. I know the weight of it. I love him enough to carry it alone. But what decades of family systems research consistently shows is that the protected partner does not experience neutral equilibrium. They experience the absence of connection without understanding its source. The mind, built for pattern recognition, fills the silence with a story. And in the absence of truth, the story the mind tells is almost always darker than reality. Leonard had spent 11 months writing the wrong story about his wife. He stayed at the kitchen table until he heard her come back through the house. Heard the quiet sounds of her moving through the hallway, not expecting him to be home. He heard her stop when she reached the kitchen doorway. He looked up. She stood in the doorway in the late afternoon light, and in the space of 1 second, he watched every calculation pass across her face. How long he had been there, whether he had heard, what it would mean if he had. Her hand went to the doorframe. "Simone," he said. His voice was quiet, completely level. The voice of a man who has already done his grieving in the next room. She didn't speak. She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him. Her hands were folded on the table, and she was looking at them, not at him. "Tell, Heru." "Me," he said. She told him. She had found the lump 14 months ago, she said. Before she was even certain what it was, she had already decided in the first terrified hours after her doctor called her in for the follow-up imaging, that she was not going to tell Leonard until she knew exactly what they were dealing with. The diagnosis came back as early-stage breast cancer, treatable, her oncologist had said, with a treatment plan and time. The first surgery was scheduled and completed, quietly, on a day she had told him was a professional development conference in Chapel Hill. The recovery had been harder than expected. The follow-up imaging in August had shown something the doctors wanted to monitor. The second surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks from now. "I was going to tell you," she said, "after the second surgery, after I knew the outcome. I was going to sit down and tell you all of it at once, when I could also tell you it was over." 11 months, Simone. "I know, Isaiah has been watching you disappear for 11 months. The sound she made was small and terrible. "I know," she said again. "Let's step outside the story here, because what Simone did, and why she did it, follows one of the most deeply documented patterns in family psychology. Researchers call it the caregiver collapse, though in this particular form it runs in reverse. It is not the caregiver who burns out, but the patient who becomes their own isolated caregiver, determined to protect the people they love by bearing the crisis alone. The instinct is almost always rooted in genuine, profound love. It is also almost always catastrophically isolating, for everyone in the household, not just the person carrying the secret. The partner on the outside experiences what psychologist Pauline Boss has called ambiguous loss, grief for someone who is still present, confusion that has nowhere to land, a formless anxiety that the mind converts into whatever explanation is closest at hand. In Leonard's case, the explanation his mind had constructed, that his wife was withdrawing because she had stopped wanting their marriage, was the single most painful story available. And it had cost him 11 months of unnecessary suffering that the truth, however frightening, would have prevented. Leonard reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, and he left it there. She looked up at him for the first time since she had sat down. He didn't say anything immediately. He just sat with her in the silence of the kitchen, in the last of the afternoon light, and let her feel that he was still there. "Who else knows?" he finally asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Renata. She's been driving me to the appointments when you thought I had evening sessions." He nodded slowly. "Your sister," she said. He went very still. "Patricia?" Simone looked at him steadily. "She called me 8 months ago. She said she was worried about you, that you had called her and sounded lost, and she wanted to understand what was happening. I shouldn't have. But I asked her not to tell you. I didn't want you to have 2 people trying to manage you through it." Leonard sat back. He thought about all the phone calls with Patricia, the gentle way his sister had kept steering their conversations, toward patience, toward giving Simone space, toward trusting that things would come clear. He had thought she was being philosophical. She had been protecting his wife. He was the only person in his own life who had not been trusted with what was happening to his own family. He excused himself. He drove to Patricia's house across town and sat in her driveway for a moment before going to the door. She opened it before he reached the porch. She had been crying, not recently, but recently enough. She looked at his face and didn't try to explain. "Come in," she said. They sat at her kitchen table. He had spent most of his life at one kitchen table or another, working out the hardest things, and he understood now that this was not an accident. That kitchen tables were where families went when the conversation required a surface to anchor them. She was terrified, Patricia said. Not of the illness. I want you to understand that. She talked about the cancer the way you'd expect a strong woman to talk about it, practically, with a plan. What she was terrified of was what it would do to you. She should have let me decide that. Yes, Patricia said. She should have. I told her that. But Leonard, you know as well as I do what happened with Mama. He did know. Their mother had received her diagnosis and told the family in stages. First Patricia, then, 3 months later, Leonard, then gradually everyone else. She had not meant it as a hierarchy of trust. She had meant it as protection. But Leonard had spent years quietly carrying the knowledge that he had been the last to know, that his mother had weighed him and found him in need of shielding, and that weight had never fully left him. Simone knew that story. She had held it gently, carefully, the way you hold something belonging to someone you love. And then, when her own crisis arrived, that same story had shaped the choice she made in the worst possible direction. She had been so determined not to make Leonard feel like his mother's illness had made him feel that she had made him feel exactly the same way. He drove home. Isaiah was back from practice, sitting at the kitchen table, with his homework spread in front of him, and he looked up when Leonard came through the door. One look at his father's face, and the homework was forgotten. "Dad, I need to talk to you," Leonard said. They sat together in the living room, and Leonard told him the truth. All of it. His son listened in the careful, quiet way of a teenager who has already been carrying something heavy and has been waiting for an adult to finally share the weight. When Leonard finished, Isaiah was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I knew something was wrong with Mom. Not what. But I know you did. I didn't want to make it worse by asking." He looked at his father. "Was that wrong?" "No," Leonard said. "That was you trying to protect her the same way she was trying to protect us. We've all been doing the same thing. That's what's going to have to change." There is a term in family therapy for what had been constructed inside the OC household over those 11 months. Family researchers call it a protective coalition, an informal, unspoken arrangement in which multiple members of a family system organize around a shared secret, each one believing they are acting out of love, each one absorbing a portion of the emotional burden, and each one inadvertently deepening the isolation of the person left outside the circle. The person being protected does not experience protection. They experience distance without a name for it. And that nameless distance, the shape of something hidden, felt but not seen, is often more psychologically damaging than the truth would have been. Leonard had been inside that shape for almost a year. He had built elaborate and incorrect explanations for it. He had almost made a permanent decision based on those explanations. That evening he sat with Simone for a long time in the sunroom where he had heard her voice through the cracked door. The light outside had gone from gold to gray. Isaiah had made them all cups of tea, quietly, without being asked, and left them on the side table and retreated to his room. "I had the documents drawn up," Leonard said. He said it plainly, because she deserved the full weight of what the silence had cost. "I had a meeting with an attorney. The folder is still in my jacket." She closed her eyes. "I want you to know that," he said, "not to punish you. I want you to know it because you need to understand what it cost. Both of us need to understand it." She nodded. "And I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere." His voice held. He was proud of that. "Not because of obligation. Because I have been in love with you for 17 years, and I am not going to let 11 months of the wrong story undo that. But Simone, you have to let me in. Whatever happens with the surgery. Whatever happens after. You cannot do this alone again." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I didn't think I could be the person who needed help," she said quietly. "I'm the one who helps people. Every day. That's what I do." "I know," he said. "That's the part we're going to have to figure out together." There is a pattern that shows up again and again in the research on couples who navigate health crises, and it has named the helper identity trap. It occurs most often in caregivers, counselors, nurses, social workers, people who have built their entire sense of self around being the one who holds things together for others. When illness comes for them personally, the instinct is not to reach out. The instinct is to manage it privately, to never let the people who depend on their strength see the strength fail. Simone had spent 20 years as a school counselor absorbing other people's hardest seasons, and in doing so, had constructed an internal rule so deep it had become invisible. Needing help is not something I do. The cruelest irony is that this rule, which felt to Simone like an act of love, had nearly cost her the marriage she was trying to protect. The second surgery took place 6 weeks later. Leonard was in the waiting room. He had arranged coverage at work, arranged Isaiah's schedule with a neighbor down the street who had known them for years, and driven Simone to the hospital himself in the early morning dark. She had not asked him to come. He had simply shown up in the hallway at 5 in the morning, car keys in hand, and looked at her in a way that didn't leave room for argument. The surgeon came out after 2 hours and 40 minutes. The procedure had gone well, she said. Clean margins. They would monitor closely over the next 6 months, but all early indicators were positive. Leonard sat back in the plastic chair in the waiting room. He pressed both hands flat on his knees and exhaled slowly, fully, the way you exhale when something you have been holding releases all at once. He called Patricia first, then Renata, then Isaiah, who was at school and answered on the second ring and said nothing for a moment when Leonard gave him the news, and then said quietly, "Okay, good. Tell her I said okay." Recovery was not simple. It was not linear. There were hard days. Days when Simone was exhausted and short-tempered and apologized for being short-tempered, which sometimes made things worse. Days when Leonard didn't know the right thing to do and did the wrong thing, and they had to have the conversation about it afterward. Those conversations were not easy. They were also, Leonard found, not impossible. The practice of having them made them gradually less impossible, which was perhaps the most unexpected thing he learned in those months. He told his wife the truth, that he was scared, that he had been scared for a long time, even before he knew what he was scared of, that he did not know how to hold space for someone else's illness while managing his own fear, and that he was learning, but he needed her to know that learning was not the same as struggling. She told him the truth, that receiving care was harder for her than giving it, that every time he did something kind for her during her recovery, she felt a complicated shame that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the story she had always told herself about who she was, that she was working on dismantling that story, slowly, and she needed him to know that the dismantling was going to take longer than the recovery. He told her that was all right. 2 things rebuilt a marriage in those months. Not one thing, not a single moment of reconciliation. 2 things, practiced consistently and imperfectly over time. The first was honesty that arrived before it was comfortable. Not honesty delivered when the moment was perfect and the words were ready. That kind never comes. The kind that says, "I'm scared," or "I'm angry," or "I need something right now," while the fear or the anger or the need is still present and uncomfortable and unresolved. The second was showing up in the ordinary ways. Leonard came home for dinner. Simone started leaving coffee on the counter for Isaiah in the mornings. Something she had stopped doing during the worst months of treatment, and the fact that the coffee was there again was the kind of signal that doesn't need a conversation around it. Isaiah noticed the coffee the second day it reappeared. He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at his mother and said nothing. But he hugged her before he left for school, holding on a beat longer than usual. Simone stood in the kitchen and pressed a hand over her mouth and didn't try to stop the tears. 3 months after the surgery, on a Saturday evening, in late February when the dogwoods in the front yard were beginning to show the first small signals of what they would eventually become, Simone came out to the back porch, where Leonard was sitting with a cup of coffee in the early dark. She sat down beside him, pulled the blanket from the back of the porch chair around her shoulders, and handed him something. A folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was a handwritten list. At the top, in her careful, legible handwriting, "Things I should have told you sooner." He read the whole list. He took his time with it. When he finished, he folded it back along its original creases and held it. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I did it." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, and they sat together in the February quiet for a long time, looking at the yard and the dark shapes of the trees she had planted 11 years ago, which were, despite everything, still standing. Isaiah opened the back door sometime later, looked at the two of them, and said, "Is there food, or are we doing feelings all night?" Simone laughed. A real one, the full, unguarded kind that Leonard had been collecting quietly in the months since the surgery, the way you collect evidence of something you had almost stopped believing in. "There's soup on the stove," she said. "Cool." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Also, for the record, the two of you are my favorite people." He delivered this with the absolute flatness of a 17-year-old who means every word and would die before admitting it, and then went back inside. Leonard looked at Simone. "We almost lost this," he said. "I know," she said. "We're not going to again." She shook her head. "No, we're not." The soup got cold. Neither of them moved for another 20 minutes. The dogwoods in the front yard held still in the February air, patient and unhurried, waiting, as they always had, for the right season to come back. 2 weeks later, Leonard received a text message from an unknown number. He was at his desk, at work, mid-morning reviewing a file. The phone buzzed. He glanced at it. "Mr. Osi, you think you know everything that happens past 11 months. You don't. There are things your wife and Renata kept from you that have nothing to do with the illness. You deserve to know what was actually said about you." Leonard read it once, then again. He set the phone face down on his desk. He sat for a long time in the quiet of his office, looking at the wall, at the framed photo on the corner of his desk. The three of them at Isaiah's freshman orientation. Simone's hand in his, both of them laughing at something Isaiah had just said. He thought about ledgers, about the difference between a number that looks wrong and a number that is wrong, about the patience required to verify before concluding, about the 11 months he had spent building a story from incomplete information and how close that story had come to becoming permanent. He picked up his phone. He turned it face up. He read the message one more time. Then he called Simone. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, everything okay?" "Yes," he said, and he meant it mostly. "I need to show you something tonight. Can we talk after dinner?" "Of course," she said. No hesitation. That was new. That was something they had built. He put the phone down. He went back to the file on his desk. He did his work, carefully and methodically, the way he had always done it. But in the back of his mind, the message sat there, quiet and deliberate, like a crack in something he had just finished repairing, waiting to see whether it would hold.